Okay, let me see if Grace is on. Grace, are you here yet? Yes.
Yes.
You want to say hello to everyone?
I just wanted to welcome everybody. I'm so happy that you're here. This is a priority issue for us, is redistricting. And thank you for taking an interest. It is vital to our democracy.
So thank you guys again so much for being here. This is amazing. We have about 100 people on the call right now, which is excellent. So Dave and I wanted to give you some background information to start out to get you caught up on the current events, kind of everything that's been going on for the past year and a half or so.
Which is much. I mean, you know, it's not much.
Redistricting is always a complicated story to tell and keep track of, and there's so many details, especially in Texas. Texas is just one of the most complicated states, I think, in the nation to follow redistricting in. So I'm going to start with the public input hearings to give you guys an update on that. So back in 2019, during the legislative session, the redistricting committee had 3 organizational hearings, and these are different than the regular committee hearings that they have. And the point of these organizational hearings was to get their committee ready for the next round of redistricting. This is the House committee, by the way, if I didn't say that. And so they said that they were going to, invite groups from the public, groups like the League and Clean Elections and the NAACP and LULAC, and give them an opportunity to provide input on where the public input hearings should be. They didn't do that. And so they did not take any public input whatsoever, and that was really concerning. And so we had already started preparing testimony on, on where these public input hearings should be. And we started raising a red flag saying, this isn't right, this isn't wrong, the public deserves to be a part of this. They ignored us. I think we went back and forth 2 or 3 times, and finally we got frustrated. And around this time, federal court in San Antonio was considering putting the state back under preclearance. It's called bail-in. And we'll be talking about preclearance a little bit in the presentation, but for any of you guys that don't know, preclearance was part of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was gutted, so preclearance is gone, except for states and jurisdictions that have a history of discrimination. If you do something really bad, district court can say you need to go back under preclearance. And preclearance means that you have to get all of your voting rights laws or your election laws and any changes to your election procedures and stuff like that approved by a federal authority, basically. So because Texas behaved so badly in the 2011 round of redistricting, the federal district court was considering putting the state back under preclearance. And the judge during that hearing said, what makes me want to trust Republicans right now? You did not, in 2011, when you had this, this process going, you did not include the public. You didn't have maps to show them. You didn't broadcast, or you didn't advertise the locations of the public input hearings. And you chose public locations that were small cities, basically. So we took that quote from the judge because here, the organizational, the redistricting committees were already trying to do the same thing for this round of redistricting. So we took the quote from the judge and we got a story in the press about it. And within, I would say, a few days of that article running, the House Redistricting Committee turned around and said, oh, wait, no, look, we're adding a bunch of public input hearings, which was great. So they went from 14 and increased that all the way up to 28. So they actually doubled the number of public input hearings. And so they had started them last September in 2019, maybe it was August of 2019, I can't remember exactly. But the COVID pandemic has really hampered their ability to hold hearings. And so what we had asked for was for them to hold virtual hearings. And this past June, we wrote to the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor and the Speaker of the House and requested that these public input hearings continue and that virtual accommodations be put in place. We never received a response to that letter. And so I believe it was mid-July where the Speaker of the House and also I think the Senate as well said that, you know, we can't have virtual hearings. The House and Senate rules don't allow for them. And so we wrote yet another round of letters. This one was from the Texas Civil Rights Project. They led this effort for the third round. I can't remember how many rounds, but that round of letters. And, you know, they brought up a good point. You know, you're not voting on legislation at these public input hearings. There's no reason why you couldn't continue these in a virtual format. It's not really truly official committee hearing. But of course, they came back and said, no, I'm sorry, you can submit written testimony. So we just yesterday, or the day before, I guess, sent another round of letters reiterating our request for virtual public input hearings. We also reiterated our request to have virtual hearings during the legislative session. The health and well-being of our citizens is important, but also our ability to participate in the legislative process is also vital. It's going to be vital to any legislation that they pass, but it's going to be incredibly important for any redistricting system that you work in. So that was just sent off yesterday. So we'll wait to see what they say, but I doubt they're going to be holding any public input hearings in the next month since it's the holiday season. The Fair Maps Texas Coalition, though, was very frustrated. And so I think with the invite that we sent to legislators, one of the league members helped craft that letter, the invite, and they had the most perfect language in there. We want the ability to be both seen and heard. So I think that needs to be like our hashtag for this virtual public input hearing campaign. It was great. So anyways, the Fair Maps Texas Coalition is going to be hosting our own virtual public input hearings because this isn't very difficult to do, right? Everyone is capable of using Zoom. With Zoom, you also have access to a phone. So if you don't have a computer, you can still call in. And then we are making a transcript of the virtual input hearings so that written testimony can be submitted directly to the committees and become a part of the official legislative record. So that's kind of the story of the public input hearings. So we encourage everyone to please participate. If you don't want to participate in the public input hearings that we're holding, that's okay. You can still submit written testimony as well. And then we'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. But I'm going to pass it over to Dave, and Dave's going to give you an update on the census.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Grace. It's good to see you and all the league members that are part of this. I appreciate being included in this presentation. Joaquin, I'm sure would have done a much better job, but unfortunately he wasn't feeling well. So I'm a last minute substitute, but I'll try to do the best I can. Let me just, before we get too far away from what you were saying, Stephanie, I think it's, you know, it is real important. The story of these public input hearings has not really been completely written yet. I mean, it's going to be up to all of you and others to show up and be heard. And it's really that's the most important part. And it's been disappointing that we haven't had the opportunity to be heard by these committees during the interim. We've lost a lot of time, unfortunately. We disagreed with their interpretation of the rules, but it's their rules. So those were the ones that we were left with, and we're trying to do the best we can. And thanks to the league for transcribing these upcoming virtual hearings that we're going to do, and that way the testimony will get submitted to the committees in a format that'll be legally valid and should be something they should consider. And it's not as good as having the committees actually there, but it's still going to be very important. Anyway,
let me add one thing really quick. As you said that, so I want to point out that the House was able to hold 13 public input hearings. If you did attend one of those committee hearings and provide testimony, you still need to submit testimony to the Senate separately. And right now the Senate has not held a single public input hearing, and that is very, very concerning. So, okay. All right. Thanks, Dave. Yeah.
Well, you started, Stephanie, by asking me to go into what's going on with the census. It's a mess. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, the pandemic, I guess, is probably the first thing that might be at fault, but I think it's probably fair to put a lot of fault on the administration in the way that they've handled it, because they kind of did a start and stop on accumulating the census data, and it put everything in a situation where the poor folks at this Census Bureau are just trying to figure out sort of where they are at this point. But in any event, the census data was halted as far as the accumulation of some of the information for a couple of months because of the pandemic. They weren't able to send people door to door, and at first we thought there was going to be an extension of the census reporting deadline, but then the administration changed its position and went back to the original statutory deadline that exists at the moment, and that is that the final census data will be reported to the president on by December 31st. So it's caused the Census Bureau to have to really rush to try to gather additional data in the time that they've had. And there is a United States Supreme Court case that's currently pending that will potentially have an impact on it, on the timing. It's really hard to know. It's a case called Trump versus New York, and it was argued in front of the United States Supreme Court on November the 30th. It's really about the president asked the Census Bureau to come up with two sets of data, basically, to one that would exclude undocumented immigrants, and then the other that would count all persons, which is what the Constitution requires. And there's been a dispute about that, about whether that can even be done. The statement that the president then has to report to the Congress that's used for apportionment is due after the data is reported to the president, and there's actually some statutory limitations that restrict the president as far as what's in the statement. I mean, at least that's part of the Trump versus New York lawsuit, whether or not he can actually even try to exclude or have a separate report for undocumented immigrants. And that's caused some confusion, but it may not, given sort of the tone of the oral arguments that were presented on November 30th and the way it was received by the court, it sounds like at least in my view, it sounds like the court is probably going to go ahead and require that the statement of what the population data is be such that it includes all persons. Whether or not they'll allow the president to also have some other separate, or the Census Bureau to have some other separate declaration of undocumented immigrants is sort of up in the air. Whether or not that will delay anything is a question. Whether or not it will even affect enough persons, because there's a huge problem that the Census Bureau has in trying to even determine who all the people are, and whether or not they've filled out the census already or not. That's an issue. So anyway, the bottom line is it's not real clear when the census data will be reported. It's the Census Bureau just a week or so ago said that because of all these problems, it may not be able to get the report until the end of January or maybe even February. So it's unknown then when that report will get forwarded, because after that there's some other requirements that the Census Bureau refine the data state by state in the apportionment data and report that to the states. And I don't know whether we want to get into that or not, but that may affect the timeline for Texas redistricting, because typically Texas receives its data usually in February or March. They're required to receive it by April the 1st in a typical year. Now it seems like it may be be after April 1st before they get the apportionment data. And it could even be into the summer, some people are saying. But that is all completely unknown at this point. So
I wanted to mention really quick that the ACLU of Texas was actually a plaintiff in New York versus Trump. And the League of Women Voters of Texas filed an amicus brief supporting their claim. So I just want to state everyone in the coalition very much is in agreement with the ACLU's case, that we believe undocumented immigrants have a right to be here just as much as everyone else and be counted. So that was our position, and that's what our amicus brief argued. Just wanted to let everyone know that. Okay, so let's go ahead and start the presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Since there are so many folks on the call, I'm going to go through, background, just the usual spiel. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this many times, but I'm going to go over it one more time for those who haven't. So for the League, we have the People-Powered Fair Maps initiative. It's a new initiative. The League is very much focused on redistricting efforts in all states across the US. So just if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to the National League's website to find out some of the details. And then for our efforts here in Texas, we have the Fair Maps Texas Coalition. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that is in the coalition. They all do amazing work and we all work very well together. So we've already covered current events. So let's talk about redistricting now really quick. I'll try to get through this pretty quickly. And Dave, please feel free to jump in wherever you want to. So redistricting is one of the most important processes in our democracy because it determines the power of your vote. It determines how your community is represented, who will be included in your district, and ultimately who will be elected to represent you. That elected official then turns around and makes very important decisions about the quality of the air you breathe, the quality of your water, the quality of your child's school, access to healthcare, and so many more decisions. So it's important for people to be involved in the redistricting process so that we get districts that reflect our communities and keep our communities whole so we can advocate for shared needs with our neighbors. So why do we need districts anyways? I want you guys to drop yourselves back in time, pretend like it's the 1800s and you're out in West Texas and you have to set up a town. Some of the first things you're gonna need to find when you get out there is water, a way to grow food, a way to build a house. Soon enough, you might have a small town, like a small collection of houses. Then you might have a line of transportation that comes by. You'll need a grocery store, a school, a doctor's office, other stuff like that. And so that is what we refer to as a community of interest. That community of interest will eventually go on and develop a shared culture, shared history, so on and so forth. And so what you want is you want that whole community to have a good voice of representation at the legislature to make sure that you get all of the needs for your community. So let's talk really quickly about the rules for redistricting. You have both federal guidelines and state guidelines. They're pretty simple, to be honest with you. So for the federal guidelines, you have equal populations, one person, one vote. So that means all of our districts have to be the same size. You also have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that's still around. And this says that you cannot delete the power of a minority community. You need to make sure that they have ample access and ability to elect a candidate of their choice. We have a few state guidelines as well that we have to follow. Our state house districts have to follow the county line rule. That means if you can fit a district completely into a county based on its population, then that's what you need to do and you can't cross a county line. You also have Texas Senate districts. They must be single member and contiguous. But there's no requirement for compactness, by the way, for your Senate districts or for your congressional. That's why you have a lot of our congressional districts that look really, really big and span for hundreds of miles across the state in some cases. So I'm going to briefly talk about how redistricting works in this state. So what districts need to get redrawn, everything from our US congressional districts all the way down to our State Board of Education. Who is responsible for redistricting? It's the Texas legislature. So politicians themselves are drawing their own election maps. The maps are passed as regular legislation, and so that's important to keep in mind. And so that tells you that whoever has control of the legislator, whichever party is in control of the legislator at the time the maps are passed, will have an outweighed say in what those maps look like. So currently Republicans are in control of the legislature, so our maps for the next 10 years will have a Republican slant. And then if gridlock occurs, the maps will get passed to the backup commission. And I think Dave's gonna give you an explanation for the backup commission, hopefully. Here we go.
Okay.
Oh, do you want to talk about the redistricting timeline first?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, this slide shows just sort of and it's actually fairly small on my screen. I don't know if it's big enough on everybody else's or not, but it shows the key deadlines that are applicable, and also talks a little bit about the Legislative Redistricting Board, which is a nuance that applies in Texas to state legislative districts. And and is a backup, sort of, that's a polite way to say it, if the legislature fails to actually enact a redistricting plan at the end of the first regular session after the decennial census. It includes 5 members, and I think we've got a slide that shows that. But before we go on to that, let me say what some of the basic deadlines are. And this is actually a projected timeline that the Legislative Council, which is the sort of the lawyers for the legislature, they do the drafting and have a lot to do with how the redistricting information is distributed. And this was a timeline that was up on their website a long time ago. I think it may still be up there, but because of the problems with the census, I'm not sure how accurate it is anymore, because some of the times that are listed there may change. But there's some key dates. I mean, and obviously the first regular session is the time frame that we're looking at, and that's required by the Texas Constitution. That the legislature address that, and then if they fail to do that, there's this backup from the Legislative Redistricting Board, but that there are also provisions for special sessions if some of those different provisions fail. So I guess another key date is the date that applies to any legislation, and there's a deadline for filing bills, and redistricting bills are, yeah, you're circling it there, March. I can't read it on mine.
It's March 12th.
March the 12th, right? Redistricting bills are just like any other bills. They have to be filed on time, and that's potentially a problem in the upcoming legislature. I don't know what might be able to be done if the census data is late, or there's some changes, or whether that possibly could be changed in some way by the legislature itself.
So what they've done right now is they filed what is called placeholder legislation. And so they have the ability to modify bills and legislation in committee and on the floor. And so for right now, they have a shell bill that's there. And once they receive the census data and start working on the maps, they'll go back and modify this shell bill.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, the other thing that's potentially relevant to that is that, and I was listening to a seminar this morning with the director of the Legislative Council, and I asked him point blank if they had any idea when they might receive the census data, and he didn't know any more than any of the rest of us do, I guess. But one thing he did talk about was the fact that legislation could begin to move forward even without the final population data, and that might include even hearings. I mean, this would be up to the legislature to decide whether they want to do that or not. You know, there is some preliminary data that's out there. The Census Bureau does a community survey that gives a lot of population data. Potentially, there's a lot that the legislature could proceed to do with based on these shell bills, even without the final population data. That's very concerning, and it might even be something that would be a violation of the United States Constitution, and because there's certain requirements as far as having public input and some other things that might make that so that it's very problematic. But it's that's it. Just because they don't have the final data doesn't mean they might be able to proceed with some consideration of redistricting issues. Anyway, I think that's good enough. Here's the article in the section in the Texas Constitution about the Legislative Redistricting Board, which is this weird feature that Texas has. That's frightening to me, at least, because what happens is if the legislature fails, or if the redistricting bill that the legislature passes is vetoed by the governor, this Legislative Redistricting Board takes over, and it's 5 members that are the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker of the House, the Attorney General, the Comptroller of Public Accounts, and the Commissioner of the General Land Office. All of those offices are currently in the hands of one political party, so it would be a situation where there would be probably some clear partisan bias that might result, or at least potentially.
So if that census data comes in before the end of the legislative session, one of the possibilities then is our state legislative districts could be, if the maps aren't finished, the maps for those could be kicked to the backup commission. So everyone keep that in mind as we move forward.
There you go. Go ahead, Steph.
Okay, so all of that is like, you know, rules and regulations and stuff like that, and it's kind of easy to keep track of. So, subtly. At any rate, what is making our current process so bad? And the answer to that is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is redistricting gone wrong. It is a practice of drawing district lines to favor one group of people over another. We have 2 types of gerrymandering in the US today. We have partisan gerrymandering and we have racial gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering was outlawed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So legislators are not allowed to draw districts based on race to a certain extent, unless they're trying to draw a district to give a minority community a voice of representation. We also have partisan gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering, unfortunately, was upheld by the Supreme Court. They said, I think it was in 2018, 2019, they said that partisan gerrymandering was too much of a political question and they wanted the federal courts to stay out of it, basically. And so partisan gerrymandering, of course, is when legislators draw districts based on which political party you're associated with, and they can get election data. They have everyone's voting history data of not only how many times you voted in the past year, but where you voted in the primary, if you voted with the Republicans or in the Democratic primary. And they have access to other data as well. But they basically go and draw districts based on partisanship. The problem with these two being in existence here in Texas is that race and partisanship often go hand in hand. And so these two are inextricably connected, and it will be very difficult to untangle these two. And that's why you have a lot of litigation that results, because the states in this past round of litigation claimed, you know, in 2011, we drew these districts simply on a sheer partisan gerrymander. And I think the governor, who was the AG at the time, even had a quote saying, "Who cares if there's incidental findings of racial discrimination? We drew this on partisanship." It was pretty insulting and disgusting. At any rate, that's why you see so much litigation.
So sweet.
That's why you have so much litigation here in the state. So the whole purpose of gerrymandering, though, is to give a political advantage to the party that's in control. So let's start back here in the 90s. Democrats were just as bad as Republicans at gerrymandering. In fact, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they were very heavy-handed against the Republicans here in the state. Here is the outcome of the first congressional race after Democrats redrew the maps in the 1990s. Democrats only won about 50% of the votes, yet they captured 70% of the seats. And this gerrymander right here is considered one of the it is the third worst in US history, based on some mathematical models that are available now to measure how much gerrymandering is too much. Let's come up here to 2018, take a look at the outcome of the 2018 congressional election here in Texas. Let's go to Republicans. Republicans won 50.5% of the vote, just about, but they captured 63% of the seats. So right now there's a 3 to 4 seat advantage to Republicans here in this state. So how are the maps drawn? Legislators consult with data analysts, state party officials, and special interest groups. They also have access to micro-targeting data. That's something new that's shown up in the past 10 or 15 years, especially with Facebook and other social media platforms. A lot of this information is sold. So your Facebook feed, who you like and follow and stuff like that, becomes public. What am I trying to say? Facebook sells it to groups. So the legislator will meet behind closed doors, and they do not have to consider the public's input when they draw the maps. They use partisan and demographic data to go block by block and choose their voters. And here at the bottom as an example, this is Congressional District 35, and I've blown it up in San Marcos for you. You can see how with this district, they've literally gone block by block. And in fact, I don't know if you can see my mouse waving around, but with Texas State University, the university was split in half. I want to quickly talk about racial gerrymanders, and sometimes there is a reason for why these districts are shaped a funny way. Here in Texas, this one is a big culprit. It was at the center of litigation for the past 10 years, but not many people realize that MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legislative, what is it? No, that's MALC, sorry. Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, I believe. At any rate, MALDEF drew this congressional district, and they claimed the reason for it was to give the Hispanic and Latino community a voice of representation. And that's fine. I understand that they were trying to, give that community a voice of representation. I think one of the problems was, though, over the past 10 years, when the legislator considered minority growth from 2000 to 2010, 90% of that growth that we saw in the state was from the minority community. And so when they went to draw maps, they should have adopted more than just one new majority-minority district. They should have adopted 3 or even 4. And they didn't do that. And so when they adopted this district, a federal district court said, when you did that, you actually weakened the voice of representation of Latinos and the Hispanic community statewide. Can everyone mute themselves, please? Okay, so the other district I want to talk about really quick is this one up here in Chicago on the right-hand side of the screen. This one was drawn again for Hispanic. I think the south part of the district is Hispanic, and the top, I believe, was Puerto Rican. At any rate, they drew this community or this district to give this community a voice of representation. However, on the flip side, Republicans have said that, when you did this, you locked out Republican control of the district, and it's been Democratic for the past 15 years. So cracking and packing is how they accomplish this when they draw these districts. So I'm going to show you an example. Here's Travis County in Austin. It's this red district right here. So here it is in the 90s. It's almost whole. They've had to start whittling away because our population was increasing. Come over here in 2017, though. This is our current district maps that we have right now. And when Republicans drew our current maps, they split Travis County amongst 5 congressional districts. And these congressional districts span from, the west side of Austin all the way over to the west side of Houston. Congressman Doggett goes from Austin and San Antonio. Congressman Williams goes from San Marcos all the way up to Fort Worth. So some of them do span like 150, 200 miles. And the reason that they did this was they wanted to dilute down the Democratic base in Austin. So they've cracked, is the term, they've cracked the district, or they cracked our population into 5 separate districts. On the flip side, they can also use packing, and packing, one of the examples I give is Congressional District 35, the one that I was just talking about on the slide before. And so with this one, there is a very, very large number of Hispanic and Latino community members that live in that district. And the reason that they adopted that district was, it's a complicated story like you saw on the previous slide, but they tried to pack in as many Hispanic and Latinos into that community to weaken their voice of representation in neighboring districts. Okay, so I want to go back and emphasize the point about race and partisanship. And so right now in the legislature, or actually currently when you look at the demographics of Texas, we have 58% people of color. That's our total population. But when you look up at the legislature, you only have 36% people of color that have been elected. And so that skew that you see can be attributed to partisan gerrymandering. Okay, one of the most important slides of the whole talk is not everyone realizes that there are serious outcomes to the way the districts are drawn. And I wanted to walk you through and point some of them out to you. Legislators draw safe districts for themselves. Safe means that when they draw a district, they give a huge electoral advantage to one party or another for a district. And so that means that the Republican Party or the Democratic Party will win that district, in some cases as much as 35 to 40%. So when they draw a safe district, the election is moved from the general election to the primary. And when the election, the true race for the district moves to the primary, what you see is more party polarization. A lot of times the people that get elected in the primaries have to shift farther and farther to the extremes in order to win that race. This also means that legislators can't be held accountable in the general election. If we want to hold our legislators accountable, we need to go and vote in the primary election. It also means that incumbents get reelected over and over again, and it's hard to find challengers. Races go uncontested, and then you are left with no choice at the ballot box, and you have a low voter turnout as a result. So one of the solutions for this, and it's not the only reform that Fair Maps Texas and the League supports, we support many different reforms, but one that's very popular is something called an independent redistricting commission. It's where you take the power of drawing district maps away from legislators and you give it to an independent body. Some states, this independent body consists of citizens, and other ones, they are elected by or appointed by legislators. At any rate, you want to remove legislative influence as much as possible from the redistricting process. So I'm going to go over the California model really quick. When you look at the composition of the commission, you see a partisan balance of the commissioners. The commission has to use very strict nonpartisan criteria when they draw the districts, and that is very, very important to remember. So they don't know who's a Democrat, who's a Republican. The only thing that they consider is district size, equal populations, and then they also base it on public input. People will come out and say, this is my neighborhood, please keep me grouped together and grouped with this other nearby city because we have a lot in common. IRC ensure that voters have a choice at the ballot box. Let me see what else. What will it take for Texas to get such a commission? For our congressional districts, so we can get a commission with just a regular state statute. For our state legislative districts, though, we'll need a constitutional amendment, and that will be a heavy lift. And so we're hoping that over the next 10 years, we might be able to get something like that set up here in Texas. But for this upcoming legislative session, just being honest, it's probably not going to go anywhere, even though we're filing the legislation this time around. Okay, so I want to go over the public input hearings because this is why you guys showed up. This is our chance to influence the next district maps. I want to point out that in 2011, it was the House delegations that drew their own districts to a certain extent. And there was actually a lot of reports of backroom deals and backroom trading that was going on amongst House members. So please keep that in mind, that it's important to give testimony in this process because number one, they might actually consider it. But then also your House members and your Senate members for that much as well might have a say. And so it's good to share your ideas with them about your communities of interest. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. So at the beginning of the talk, remember I said, hey, pretend like you're going out to West Texas and let's set up a town. That is a community of interest. A community of interest is a contiguous population which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its fair and effective representation. You want to be able to get together with your neighbors and advocate for shared needs, right? So I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of, first, let me give you some nonpartisan criteria that you can consider when you write your testimony. Equal population is going to be up there. You can also mention that, hey, I want you guys to, uphold the Voting Rights Act. If you sit down and you actually go as far as pulling up what your district maps look like, remember that you need to keep in mind the state house districts have to follow the county line rule. Communities of interest, so you really want to prioritize this as much as possible. You want to respect cities, counties, and neighborhoods. Compactness is another thing that you might want to consider, and nesting is another thing. Maybe you want your congressional district, your Senate district, and your House district all to overlap. That's another big one because it's really super confusing right now. People are cracked and packed and put into many different districts, and people from the same neighborhood are in multiple districts, and it just becomes very confusing to folks. Okay, so these are some good communities of interest to consider to give you guys some ideas of what you might want to include in your testimony. So if you're a member of a group that has a shared culture or history, you can share that in your testimony. A group protected under the Voting Rights Act, this is a language or racial minority group. So if you are a member of the NAACP, if you're a member of LULAC or any other such groups, you can talk about the work that you do in the community together. Any type of transportation, like if you have a main railroad or a main bus line or something like this, or it could be a lack of transportation in your area that you talk about. Common weather concerns, so hurricanes on the Gulf Coast, droughts out here in the hill country, watershed areas. That's another one that's, especially in the hill country, that can be included in the testimony. Economical regions, so industrial, agricultural, tech, army, etc. Recreational areas is also another one that you might want to write about. Maybe there's an important baseball stadium that you would like to see included in the district, or it could be something as small as a local park. This local park is important to my community and it's shared by all of these surrounding communities. Housing is another one. Language is spoken, schools, and healthcare areas. So these are more of like a positive, like this is what's in my neighborhood. And then you can also, on the flip side, talk about problems and issues that you are working on in the community. And this is what really, if you can talk about something like this and add this to your testimony, this actually looks really good. It gives your testimony more weight. So if you are working in a group in your community, I'm going to give you some examples of various policy issues you might be concerned about or working on. COVID issues, housing problems related to evictions or gentrification, school and school equity issues. Here in Austin, especially on the east side of town, there are a lot of problems with school equity issues. And there's a huge group over there advocating for those shared needs to make sure that the schools aren't closed down. There's groups and people that represent various sectors of the economy, so chambers of commerce or unions. Transportation issues. Again, if you don't have transportation in your area to get you to the doctor, to get you to the grocery store, that's something that you can mention. Environmental concerns, like serious environmental concerns. And I gave a few examples, the Ship General in Houston. And again, in Houston, there's a cancer cluster in the 5th Ward. On the south side of Dallas, there's Shingle Mountain. There's the water pipeline that we had, not only the one that's going to Bastrop, but then there's an oil pipeline that's going across Hayes County. So there's so many horrible environmental problems right now that you could talk about how you and your community are getting together to advocate for those shared needs. Election issues are very important. So if you experienced election issues, you can include that in your testimony. Poverty-related issues, so access to everyday resources. If you have a hard time getting clean water, if you live in a food desert, if you have a hard time paying for electricity and you have to apply for support for that, there's a whole bunch of stuff related to poverty that you could talk about. Jobs creation is another idea. So I quickly wanted to show you on the website where the testimony guide is, so you can see how to find it, and it actually goes through. So if you go to the website, fairmapstexas.org, and go to public input hearings, underneath there's testimony guides. And we have both the League's testimony guide up here on communities of interest, and then we have TCRP's guide that Dave's going to talk about in just a second on a fair and open process. But if you click on this one, there are a whole bunch of examples that I include in here on communities of interest. I give you an explanation, and then I give you a very neutral example of how to write testimony to respect communities of interest. And then the last one is just the nonpartisan criteria, the last page of that testimony guide. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and he's going to walk you through the Fair and Open campaign. Dave, do you want to actually control the screen?
Let me give that a shot anyway. I'll see if I can do that successfully here. Let me see, share screen. Well, maybe not. Thought I was doing it. There we go. Let me just elaborate just briefly on what Stephanie said about everything else. The community testimony about everything that's going on that you feel like is related to a cohesive community of interest, I think is really critical for the people in the legislature to hear about. And let me emphasize also one thing she said about nesting. I think that just in listening to some of the public hearings that have happened so far, the idea that certain different levels of government have been cracked in certain areas where people in one city, like here, I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in Plano, I know some of the people at the Collin County hearing were complaining about the fact that they're represented by multiple legislators. The city's divided between different legislators because of the way it was cracked. And so there's not a way to have responsiveness at different levels of government. The city is not all within one legislative district or one congressional district. And the more those things get cracked apart, it can be really difficult for people to have input into their government and to make things happen, because a lot of things happen at multiple levels of government. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but one of the main focuses that we have at the Fair Maps Texas group is to try to see if we can get the legislature to have a more fair and open process. And what I've got up on the screen now is the testimony guide. I've kind of highlighted some parts of it that's on the Fair Maps Texas website. And it sort of talks about what we think could be done to make the process more fair and open. And it would be really helpful for people to testify about how important some of these recommendations are and how good it would be if the legislature would adopt them. So let me just go through them briefly. In the past, there's been problems with the hearings, as Stephanie's already talked about. One of the biggest issues is basically having enough time for public input so that when maps begin to get disclosed, that the public has an opportunity to review those maps and have input on those maps before the legislature starts voting on them. And what we don't want to happen is to have the public maybe give a lot of input as far as the different communities of interest in a general way, but then when it comes to actually drawing the maps, have the maps drawn behind closed doors, and then at the last minute, the members of the legislature, either in committee or on the floor itself, come out with maps, and there's not even an opportunity for fair and open input, and that means a lot of things. And I so we don't take up too much time, we're already getting later here. It basically means that we would like to have hearings that are really meaningful as maps are proposed, and that means that the public needs to have access to the data that's underlying those maps, the reasons why maps were drawn in a particular way. We think it's reasonable to have legislators describe if they've changed maps to draw the lines in a way that's not consistent with traditional redistricting principles, that they explain why they did that, especially with regard to any precinct splits, any deviations that they've done in ways that would not be consistent with the communities of interest and that might disenfranchise certain groups.
So importantly for precinct splits, though, if you do include that in your testimony, the reason that we mention this is because the only data that they have access to below the precinct level really is racial data. And so you can use precinct splits as a good indicator that something fishy or nefarious is going on.
Right, and it just is one of the things that's happened in the past is that there has just not been adequate disclosure of all the underlying information that's available to members of the legislature in drawing these maps. And we don't see any reason why that if, for instance, there's different factual information that members of the legislature have developed either themselves or through consultants that they've hired to come up with information about a particular community, detailed information that may be available to them, we think that ought to be disclosed. And there's just so much information about the way we live our lives these days out on the internet and so forth that there's just a lot of ways that they can gain information about who lives in certain areas and how they might be likely to vote. They have, or whether they're likely to vote at all. Turnout is always a part of this as well, and it's a factor that is important sometimes in how they draw those lines, and it can make a difference in the impact of the lines that they draw. So we want as much to be disclosed as possible. Partisan data, we believe, should not be considered. We're not naive about that. We understand that that's something that can happen, but we still believe that it shouldn't happen, that they need to draw these lines based on the real communities of interest and not on partisan data. We want the communications to be open regarding all the maps and to explain what they're doing. Into the sample testimony, it would be good to just describe the need for transparency, how the previous maps have been drawn behind closed doors and have divided communities or disenfranchised certain groups, and explaining how that has happened in the past would be helpful. The breaking up of communities is something that the legislature needs to know that people don't approve of, and that if if the public can have adequate access to that data and to explanations about the maps, and then an opportunity finally to actually propose their own maps, alternative maps, when maps are actually presented. We see that as very important. These are just examples that I've highlighted here that's in the testimony guide of what could be said to bring out this need for a fair and open process. I'm not going to spend a lot more time doing this because I know we're getting short on time here, but I want to emphasize one point that we think is really important, and that's sort of the time frame of when information or when maps are actually disclosed by the legislature and when they're voted on. There is a history of what the legislature sometimes in committees call committee substitutes being offered at the last minute and without adequate time or any time for people to have real input and time to digest the information that would be necessary to evaluate those maps. And that's something we would like to try to avoid as much as possible. And public pressure on them to do that is something that we think could be helpful. So that's, if anybody wants to spend their testimony time talking about the need for greater transparency, for a specific time period that needs to be adequate, I would say at least 72 hours. I know there was some experience in North Carolina where when the legislature there was under some court orders, there was some deadlines that actually were set by the court. And with the ability to crunch data by computer and so forth now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a lengthy period of time, but it needs to be long enough that advocates like all of us can crunch the data and have an opportunity for reasonable input and talk about what the maps that they're presenting actually do, who they exclude, who they include, and present any alternatives that we think would be important. So that's basically the fair and open process. And I'll throw it back to you, Steph.
So I'm going to show you, because this is, so there's three things you can include in your testimony. One is info on communities of interest. The second one is a fair and open campaign. And the third is if you support any sort of reform. But we want to emphasize the fair and open campaign. This is a very important part of the process, or should be an important part of your testimony. And the reason for that is, number one, we don't have census data right now. And so for them to be holding the public input hearings, I know that they're supposed to be holding them during the interim. Now they haven't really held, the Senate at least hasn't held any whatsoever. At any rate, the optimal time to hold these hearings is after the census data. And we have reiterated this and asked them time and time again for them to switch over to holding these hearings after the census data comes in, because that's when you have the data to draw the maps. Anyways, they refuse to do it, and they say that our legislative session is too short. And so what our concern is, because the legislative session might be short again this time around, is we want to slow down the timeline for redistricting as much as possible. We want a chance to be included in this process. We want them to hold public input or committee hearings and have the public be included, so the public gets an opportunity to comment on the maps that they propose. We want the full committee to be able to see the maps before they pass out of committee, because that was a problem in 2013. There's very important stuff included in this fair and open campaign that is designed to slow down this process, to slow down the timeline so the public can review it, include it. We understand why they drew the map a certain way, the whole 9 yards. And so we've developed these advocacy points that are on the website. If you go to take action and go to the fair and open campaign, this is what shows up. And we have quotes in here that you're welcome to use. And mainly though, it's all of the advocacy points that we've developed to help slow down that timeline. Remember when I said in 2011, there were a lot of problems in Texas. Texas was the only state in the nation not to gain pre-clearance of the maps when pre-clearance was still around. And so based on all the problems we saw in 2011 and 2013, that's how we developed these advocacy points for the Fair and Open campaign. We took all the problems that went wrong and we said, how can we fix this in the next go round? And so that's what we've done. And really quickly, I wanted to show you, because the Fair and Open campaign has been very effective. A lot of you guys have already provided testimony to the House, I know that. But we were able to take clips of the testimony of you guys reiterating the advocacy points, and I'm going to show you a quick video because it makes me giggle.
To accomplish this, we asked that the committee implement guidelines to create a fair and open process.
Our group would urge members of the committee and our lawmakers to look to ways to make the redistricting process as fair and open as possible.
A fair and open redistricting process.
1, the redistricting committee should provide notice of hearings and adequate opportunities to review maps before hearings. 2, hold a public hearing with public testimony on any proposed maps after they have been drawn, but before they pass through committee.
So that we can see the maps, so that we can comment on the maps, and you can have our input about the maps that you will be presenting to the legislature.
These maps will affect our city for the next decade, and the public deserves to know the reasoning used in creating them and to have an opportunity to review and comment on the proposed maps.
Also provide the committee's rationale for boundary decisions. The public needs to know the thought process behind the decisions they make.
I would like to start by saying that the most important thing for the committee to do is to respect federal and state law, including the Voting Rights Act. None of my testimony today should be used by the legislature to justify diminishing the ability of a minority group to elect the candidate of their choices or artificially distorting maps for racial or partisan purposes.
It's an inherent conflict of interest for representatives to draw their own district.
To instill confidence among voters, we believe that maps should be drawn that focus on communities of interest. We urge you not to consider partisan data, neither retention of incumbents nor political party strength should be a consideration.
And here's the promise. We will be working night and day to expose what's happened. We believe that how redistricting is conducted should be an issue that politicians need to take a stand on, just like they take a stand on other issues, that they have to go to the public with and stand up for what they believe or what their position is. So if you want to draw maps in the dark recesses of the swamp, then we're going to work to make sure you have to state to the public that's what you believe.
So I ask you a rhetorical question. Do the 3 congressional districts shattering my neighborhood keep with the spirit of a representative democracy, or were they drawn in the spirit of something else?
Okay, and with that,
All those guys, there was like that. I love Robert Elkin there. That was him talking about the swamp. It's a great video.
it makes me giggle. I was like, that's so awesome. Sorry. Okay, that's the end. I want to make sure that everyone is comfortable, though. I have one more very, very important slide to show you from the presentation deck, and that is if you do not want to provide testimony at our virtual public input hearings. Let me get the right one up, sorry. You guys are still have the ability to submit it directly, written testimony, to the House and Senate redistricting committees. And to do that, you can, I'll be sharing this presentation and I'll be sharing a recording after it's all done. So don't worry, you don't have to jot it down or anything. You'll get it in the presentation stack, or I can put it up on the website too. At any rate, if you want to submit it to the House, you can email the committee clerk, Ashley Westenhover. She's very nice. And she's had this up and posted since day one of when the committee had started their public input hearings back in September. Also to the Senate has created their own portal. So if you want to submit written testimony, you can click on this website and it'll take you to the Senate's place to submit it. And with that, that's the last part that I wanted to say. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions? I see there's a bunch that's come up in the chat.
See a question about deadline to submit testimony. I don't know that there really is one, Stephanie. I mean, other than, I mean, at any time before the legislature begins to consider redistricting issues, sooner the better.
Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. What was that? Deadline to submit testimony? I don't think there is.
About the deadline.
No, I don't think there is a deadline to submit testimony. They haven't started working on the maps yet or the legislation. So as long as that legislation is still in the committee and they're working on the maps, then I would say it's fair game. Even after it's out of committee, they can do floor substitutions and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. So just, I would say it's not too late, but the sooner you can get it in, the better. Does anyone else have any questions? Do you want to actually just come off mute one at a time if possible, if you have a question?
I have a question, Stephanie.
Sure.
This is Miriam Fauché from Dallas.
Hey, Miriam, how are you?
If you've already signed up for testimony, how do you change the date or change from oral to written?
If you just want to submit, are you talking about for the Fair Maps virtual testimony?
The testimony that you gave the opportunity for signing up for, I think it was December 8th and December 9th.
It's the 8th and the 10th. And if you want to switch days, just feel free to email me, or you can tell me right now. Or if you want to switch from oral to written and you just prefer to submit it directly to the committees, just shoot me an email. And okay. I can put my email, and then everyone will receive a follow-up email from me after this. And then I can get it adjusted on our end.
I'd like to go on Thursday because I've not signed up yet. Do you think there's still space?
There was plenty of space on Thursday when we last looked, so that would be perfect. Right now, Tuesday is getting to be a little full. I don't mind staying. I just don't know if everyone wants to stay on past 9 o'clock in the evening to share their 3 minutes. But like I said, I'm more than happy to stay on. That's not a problem for me at all. Also, to make a quick announcement, Michael Lee is going to be joining us and opening up the Tuesday virtual testimony. And he's going to give everyone a more thorough and enlightened explanation of what we can expect for this next round of redistricting. Michael Lee is the senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice that specifically focuses on redistricting, especially here in Texas.
Hey, Stephanie, let me add one other thing also. You know, I mean, we're going to do these hearings on our own, but it's pretty much anticipated that the committees, once the legislature comes back into session, will probably have hearings as well. There'll be notice of those that I'm sure we'll be able to let you know about, or you can find out about. And there'll be opportunities to present testimony there as also. I think it's, you know, we're still hopeful that they'll figure out some way to do virtual testimony once the legislature is back in session and they can modify their rules. That's certainly something we're asking them to do, and hopefully they'll figure it out. It's going to be a pretty weird session with the pandemic, and they're still trying to decide all the rules about access to the Capitol, whether people can even be there in person or how that will work if they are there in person. And I think maybe even issues about allowing virtual testimony are still somewhat up in the air. So we still need to try to insist on the access in every way possible, in a way that's safe, of course, considering the pandemic, but also to make sure that they don't use the pandemic as an excuse to do more behind closed doors, because it's just going to be very different given all the circumstances. So there, in addition to the virtual hearings that the league is sponsoring, and we're all sponsoring, the legislature itself hopefully we'll have some opportunities where you can give testimony as well.
I see another question here that says, how can we get an example to make our case rather than say the same information repeatedly? I don't think there's a problem with saying the same info repeatedly. In fact, I think that bolsters our efforts, especially for the Fair and Open campaign. If we have 50 people show up and say the same thing, then that gets a point across. Just keep in mind that, you know, you guys are, those that show up to provide testimony are the ones that are very passionate about this, and legislators don't always get letters from constituents very often. So for every one person that sends a letter, there might be 10 or I don't know how many. It's skewed. So you guys that are showing up, we mean business. So they'll weigh that more, if that makes sense.
I'm surprised they don't get a lot of letters. I used to be one that answered letters, and so I'm surprised about that. So too bad.
The more that you have, though, the better. So if you have 2 people showing up and saying something, it's okay. But if you have 20 people showing up, then that carries more weight.
Hey, Stephanie, I had a question.
Sure.
Hey, my name is Tanya Richardson. I'm out of Houston. And I was wondering about the process next week for the 8th and the 10th. It's 3 minutes to speak your testimony, but does that also include written testimony that you can send in? Because 3 minutes is pretty condensed. And if you have more to say, it might be nice to send a letter in as well.
You're more than welcome to send in a letter separately. So we were trying to help folks that didn't have access to a computer if they needed to have their verbal testimony transcribed. That was one thing that we were going to try to help folks with. But you're more than welcome to send a letter in yourself. We ask that everyone's testimony stays with about 3 minutes. And about is the key word. I'm probably going to be the person keeping time, and I'm not very good with cutting folks off. So the legislator, though, the House and redistricting committees give everyone 3 minutes, which is what we're trying to keep in line with. So just keep that in mind. But I know there have been many instances where testimony has gone longer than 3 minutes too. So no worries.
Okay, great, thanks.
Is
And
that
also,
a couple of pages?
I'm sorry?
3 minutes, just so that we know how many pages.
How many pages? So for me, I usually come in at 3 minutes, and they usually cut me off at 3 minutes because they want me to stop talking. So that's usually a page typed. Anything more than that, yeah, 1 page typed.
Okay.
I noticed
imagine that depends on how fast you speak.
I noticed the hearing is pegged for South Texas. Is that a limitation?
No, anyone can provide testimony on either day. So we were actually supposed to be.
Oops.
Sorry. We were actually supposed to be coordinating with Mexican American Legislative Caucus. They were supposed to be having a redistricting town hall event today, but they did not come through. I think they have been too busy with other stuff, getting ready for the session and with the outcome of the election and stuff like that. And so that's why we had one of our hearings with a South Texas focus, because their town hall event, Malk's town hall event, was supposed to have a special feature on the South Texas region. So we were going to piggyback, hopefully build momentum, and people would get ideas from their event, but that never panned out. Regardless, though, you can provide testimony at either hearing, regardless of where you are in the state.
You know, on behalf of the other groups that are part of the Fair Maps Texas coalition, I do want to thank the league. I mean, it's great that these oral opportunities for oral hearing are going to be transcribed, and the league is doing that. That helps us get it in a format so that the legislature will actually accept it, and it'll have a better legal effect. And just thanks to the league for doing that.
No problem. I think it was all of our idea, though, in the Fair Maps Coalition.
Well,
our Zoom has.
But you guys came through, so.
Hey, Stephanie, I had one more technical question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I am new to this process, and you mentioned that precinct splits are suspicious or nefarious, and my brain immediately went to police precincts. I just wanted to understand which precinct were you thinking about, because I would like to review some different data this weekend and try to put together a coherent recommendation.
It's election precincts. So there's election precincts, and then there's, you can look at census blocks, and there's a whole bunch of specific terms that go along with redistricting. I can look up a link and share that in the follow-up email if you want to learn more about it.
I would love to. Thank you.
Stephanie?
Yes.
This is Miriam Fauché speaking, and there's Tanya Richardson also looks like she wants to speak. Okay, hers is muted. I have a question. I know that the league, the Texas League, the state league, purchased software to assist with setting up, designing redistricting, and I was wondering what your plans are to use that software.
We have one license that people can check out if they're interested in drawing their own maps. It's from Maptitude. You'll have to email me, and I can explain how to get access to it. There's a learning curve with all of these districting softwares, and there's also numerous free ones available online. If you want to take the next step to draw your own map or try to draw your own map, that was a completely separate talk from this, but that's a possibility, and you're more than welcome to do that. And I can also circulate the information and a link to the talk that we did on that.
So we would have to make an appointment with you, and perhaps several appointments to learn.
Pretty much, yeah. I
There's
have a limit too of how well I can use those programs, so just keep that in mind. The free ones that are available are easy to, they're not really easy to use, but they're easier, they're more accessible, let's say that. So you can just go online. There's Dave's Redistricting app, District R is another one, and each one's slightly different. So yeah.
Can you send us a list of all of those different pieces of software and any information about them?
Sure, no problem.
Great.
You know, the Princeton gerrymandering project at Princeton University is making some software available that is supposed to be fairly accessible. And you probably would include that, right, Steph, in the stuff that you'd send around?
So the Princeton gerrymandering project has a few, I'm not sure if they've released their new districting software yet, but they have one called Representable, which will allow you to draw just your community of interest basically on a map. And it's really easy to do. It's just drag a polygon and then you can label what your community of interest is. It's really easy to use.
You know, if not to interrupt.
Okay, for everyone that's still on, you guys are awesome. You guys don't have to stay on though. You guys can leave now, and I'll stick around and answer any questions that you guys have. I want to say thank you though so much for coming out. We really appreciate it, and we hope you guys will all consider providing testimony and keeping an eye on the legislator when they draw the maps. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Grace.
This was really great. And I don't stay for all the webinars. Is there a local, how to advocate in local redistricting too?
There's a guide that we have up on the League's redistricting page. It's if you want to try to create an independent redistricting commission for your city.
Yeah.
A lot of cities have ballot initiative processes, so you can put something on the ballot and have people vote on it. So here in Austin, we have an independent redistricting commission. And so if other cities want to consider that, or if you want to look into that, there's a guide on the League's website on the redistricting issue page. Excuse me. I can include a link.
Thank you, Stephanie. Keep it up.
Thanks, Bill. Bye.
Stephanie, hey, are you going to host more in public input hearings, maybe in January or in?
I should have said that at the beginning. So we're supposed to be holding 2 more just virtual public input hearings. So no guest speakers or anything like that, nothing fancy, but we will be holding 2 more virtual hearings the first week of January before the legislative session starts. We understand that that's really close to the holiday season still, but we're working on a short timeline ourselves, and we thought we better get them held before the legislative session starts because it'll be crazy once that begins. So we're looking at dates right now, so it's tentative, but we'll be sure to send out an email about it to everyone that attended today. Yeah.
Stephanie, I noticed a couple of questions in the chat that didn't get answered, but I don't know whether folks want to stick around for that or not, but you want to do that, or you're sort of in charge here?
Yeah, I'm really bad at reading and doing 2 things at once. Like no, I can't do
I'm not
that.
great at it either. But I noticed a question from Carolyn Meyer. She said, does having testimony from a group, i.e. a professional or social, like a neighborhood association with individual signatories, add any weight over individual testimony?
Yes, it would, because it's a valid community of interest for sure.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And then the other one I saw was, can we submit multiple written testimonies as the process evolves?
Yes, for sure. I plan to do so myself, because there's so much that I would like to share with them. There's a lot of research on various communities of interest that have come up, and so I do plan to do that myself, and they will accept it. Don't know if they'll read it, but
you talked about it doing a 1-pager as if you submit written testimony. I think that's probably much more likely to be read. I think there's probably not a limit, though. If you want to write a whole book about it, you're free to do that also.
Yeah, there's no limit on how much you can submit to them.
Right.
So what is the official deadline for maps to be final so that 2022 candidates can register for their races next November 2021? And it's that registration deadline. Whenever they start letting candidates register is when they basically have to have the maps in place. Justin Levite, that he used to be head of the voting rights division, the civil rights division for the Obama Justice Department. His website says the beginning of January, but I've had a lot of people in our group say, no, that's wrong. It needs to be whenever the candidate filing deadline is. I think that might be it from the questions. Are there many folks working on prison gerrymandering looking to help where we can? Yes. There for sure is. The Texas Civil Rights Project is going to be filing legislation. We filed legislation this past go around. Miguel's on the phone, or he's here. You can maybe share a little more about how far you guys have gotten.
Yeah, so Texas Civil Rights Project does have a prison gerrymandering project, and it's still in the very early stages of planning, looking at previous bills that have been submitted and looking at maybe drafting a new bill and finding sponsorship for that. And then if necessary, moving on to the advocacy step and building maybe a coalition behind that. But yes, we do have, like I said at the very beginning, and if anyone wants to find out more about that, you can email me at miguel@texascivilrightsproject.org. I can type that in the chat right now.
Someone else had a question about submitting PowerPoint slides. You can, I know in other states, they actually like if you submit like a map, like what I was talking about with Representable, you can actually print out the map that it spits out to you and take it up and submit that. So I'm pretty sure they will accept multiple formats for testimony. So if you have a PowerPoint slide you want to bring, I'm sure they would look at that and consider that as well. Does anyone else have any questions?
You know, the other thing, just I might mention for those of you guys who are being nice enough to hang on, I mean, this is mean, there's a lot of reasons why this testimony is important, and these redistricting bills often end up in litigation, as we've seen, like almost every time. So we're creating a record here that may be important regardless of whether the committees take it into consideration or not. And that record will be important. So whatever you want to submit that is relevant would almost always be good. There you go. There's my pitch for litigation.
Okay. Has Texas ever had a redistricting that didn't involve follow-on litigation?
No.
Not in, I don't know about ever, but for a very long time. The last 100 years anyway, probably.
At least for the past 50 years, they've been in court for violating the Voting Rights Act or discriminating against minority voters. So that's pretty good. It's a bad track record. You know, I helped Ashley Lopez craft a story for NPR, national NPR. And the invitation, or like the interview, was 20 minutes long, and I walked through everything with her. And like the one quote she used was that one. And during the conversation, she goes, "Wait, whoa, what did you just say?" And I started laughing. I go, "Yeah, didn't you know?" And then that's a quote that she took, but I'm laughing at it. And I'm like, actually, it's just so ludicrous. It's so awful. Like, it's just absurd. And that's why I was giggling, but it just, you know, anyways. Okay, if no one else has any questions, I'm going to end the session. Thank you guys so much for participating, and please feel free to reach out to me via email. You can even try to give me a call if you want to, if you need help putting your testimony together. I don't mind helping. All right, yeah. All right, thanks so much for your time, and have a good day.
Thanks to everybody. Appreciate it.